Welcome to the screencast Writing a Literature Review. This is part 3 of 4, Synthesizing. Here are the learning outcomes for part 3. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to write a successful synthesis that identifies trends, themes, and relationships among studies, and relate these themes and trends to your own study. This is an overview of the screencast. First, we're going to discuss the synthesis approach and how it differs from the silo approach, which you want to avoid. Then we'll talk about planning, as planning is the key to avoiding the silo approach. We'll move on to discuss signal words and how to use them in a synthesis. And then finally, we'll talk about verb tenses that are commonly used in a synthesis. But what is synthesizing? A synthesis is a combination or union or bringing together of ideas to form a theory, a system, or a whole. And synthesizing is absolutely key to a literature review because it identifies and interprets themes, trends, and relationships. It reveals similarities and differences and shows how the literature advances the research area. So most of your paragraphs in a literature review should begin with a general claim about a trend or a theme. And you can make this claim in a topic sentence. And then the body of the paragraph should use evidence to support the claim, evidence from the literature to support the claim. Now, you may want to discuss some key studies in detail in some parts of your literature review, but most of your literature review should be devoted to making general claims and then using the literature to support those claims, showing how studies are similar and how they're different. Not just focusing on these key studies. So what do we mean by a silo approach? Well, a silo is a tower in the shape of a cylinder found on a farm. And farmers use these silos to store their grain. And you'll notice if you drive through the countryside in Saskatchewan that silos are separate. So they're separate one from the other. So a farmer might have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or more, but they're always separate. So a silo approach means a non-integrated approach. So if you use that when you write a literature review, all your studies are separate. They're not integrated, they're not compared. So students who use a silo approach to write their literature review will write their first paragraph about just one study, their second paragraph about another, and their third about another, and they'll go on like that. They'll never actually compare those studies, bring ideas together into any kind of whole. But the purpose of a literature review, of course, is not to analyze each study separately, but to show how the studies relate to one another and to your own study. So that needs to be the focus of your literature review. On this slide, we can see that on the left, we have 2 silos. See how they're cylindrical and they're very separate. On the right, we have a woven cloth, which of course symbolizes the synthesis, where all the ideas are woven together into a whole. On this slide, we have some differences between the silo approach and the synthesis. In a silo approach, each study is discussed separately, comparisons are not made, relationships are not drawn, and each paragraph begins with a different author's name. Whereas in a synthesis, no study is discussed in isolation. Study findings and/or methods are compared and relationships are drawn. In a silo, there's no relationship drawn between the student's own research and the research discussed in the literature review. Whereas in a synthesis, the student's own research is at the center of the discussion, analysis, and comparison of all studies. In a silo approach, the literature review is organized chronologically or even randomly, whereas in a synthesis, the literature review is organized by the themes most relevant for the study. In a silo approach, individual studies are referred to only once, but in a synthesis, studies may be referred to several times under different themes. Well, here is an example of an extract from a student's literature review that takes the silo approach. And this literature review is on water and water treatment in the north. I'll read this extract to you. Sims and Deloye surveyed several small rural communities. They visited these communities where they looked at the water treatment facilities and interviewed those responsible for water safety. They revealed that water in Canada is under threat in terms of quality. They argued that this is particularly the case in small communities. Patrick conducted a study of uneven access to clean water for First Nations. He found that many First Nations have problems with their water supply. Infrastructure is generally poorly maintained and out of date, and there is an over-reliance on chemicals. He suggests that the problems that he and others have identified in small, remote communities are mainly due to inadequate training, high operational costs, and jurisdictional barriers. The Water Survey Agency has conducted several surveys of Saskatchewan water in northern communities. The agency has found that water systems are not well maintained in remote communities where services are lacking. So you can see then that each study is dealt with in a separate paragraph, and there are no connections, no comparisons made among these studies. Well, here is an example of the student's final draft in which she produced a synthesis. Notice the difference. Providing safe drinking water is challenging for small and rural communities, particularly for First Nation communities. The WSA found that small communities often have difficulties meeting drinking water standards because of challenges in maintaining and renewing their systems. In a survey of northern Saskatchewan communities, Sims and Deloye had similar findings, identifying limited resources and lack of capacity as the major impediments for rural systems. In related research on northern First Nation communities, Patrick identified numerous problems plaguing water treatment operations, including improper training, reliance on chemicals for water treatment, high operational costs, poor infrastructure setup, and jurisdictional problems. All the problems identified in these studies suggest that small, remote communities need support in the planning of their drinking water supply. So notice here how the student has started her synthesis with a topic sentence of her own. Providing safe drinking water is challenging for small and rural communities, particularly for First Nation communities. There's her claim right in the first sentence. Then she brings in the evidence from the three different studies. She starts with the WSA, then she brings in Sims and Deloye, and then she brings in Patrick. And she uses the signal words or connecting words like similar, and in related research to connect and compare these studies. And we'll look in a little while at signal words in more detail. And then she has a wrap-up sentence in which she brings everything together and interprets the evidence in the paragraph. So this is what you want to aim for in writing your literature review. You want to write a synthesis. You want to avoid the silo approach. But it may be easier said than done to avoid the silo approach. How can you avoid it? Well, here's one way to do that. that is to prepare a thematic outline. And you can do that either using a flow chart or you can use a regular outline. And when you've done that, prepare a chart containing the studies you have gathered with the names of the studies you have gathered. And it should show similarities and differences among the studies. Then create a table. The table should have 2 columns. Place the headings from your outline in your left column. And then in the right column, insert the studies wherever you think they might fit, the studies from your chart, wherever you think they might fit. I'm going to show you how this might work. So here's a sample partial flowchart for a literature review, for the same literature review we were just reading. So this student has opted to use this method for organizing her literature review. So she starts with her introduction and her main headings along the top here, and then ending with a summary. And then she has the subheadings tearing down from some of the main headings. And then she's got the subheadings underneath. And this is just a section of her literature review. And this actually comes from this organization comes from an Australian company called Reasoning Lab, Tools for Critical Thinking and Decision Making. And if you Google them, you can find simple ways of creating this kind of flow chart. So we can assume that the student has also got a chart together where she's listed all the studies and she's had some kind of organizing principle for that chart to show how the studies are similar and different. So here's what this student did. So she created this table. In the left-hand column, she put in her headings, her main headings, her subheadings, and her sub-subheadings from her flowchart outline. And then on the right-hand side, this would have been blank when she started. She took her chart with the studies on it, and then she took the studies and she inserted them where she thought they might fit, in the themes under which they might fit. And so you can see here, the interesting thing about this is that some of the studies fit under multiple themes. So you see here that Patrick is in the first theme, main theme, and in the second. Blundell comes under all of these themes, the main theme and the sub-themes, all the way through. Wood comes this sub-theme, this sub-theme, sub-sub-theme, and this sub-sub-theme. So why this planning approach helps you to avoid this writing in silos, is that you can see how if you follow this order, you will talk about Blundell under 4 different themes. So you're not going to fall into the trap of talking about Blundell, for example, in just one paragraph. So this is the method that I encourage you to use so you can avoid writing about studies in silos. Moving on then to signal words or linking or connection words used to synthesize evidence. And these are actually, they're just small, often small words, short phrases, but they actually can make a big difference to your writing. They can make it seem very sophisticated if you use these words to show similarity and difference. So on the left here, I have a list of words and phrases used to show similarity in comparison. Similar, similar to, similarly, likewise, both, and, also, not only, but also, in related similar research, and to. And then we also have comparable to, compare to, compare with, correspond with, related to. And so notice how when you use these kinds of signal words in a paragraph, they draw comparisons among authors. So here's a sort of broken up paragraph on the right. Smith found that American adolescents something on social media. Similarly, May determined that teenagers, something something. Both May and Lee found, Jones also found that. In similar research, Murray concluded that. Likewise, Frank and Salk. So you can see that using these common signal words and phrases, you can link the ideas together of authors' works. And then we have the Canadian results are comparable to or correspond with those of a similar size French study by Robert. In related research, Brown found that, again, these are ways to link studies, bring them together. And then we have the signal words that depict difference, contrast, contrary to, on the contrary, on the other hand, in contrast to, unlike, and conversely. And we also have but, whereas, while, however, and although. These are all words that we can use to show difference and contrast. So here's an example of these words used and these phrases used in a paragraph. Contrary to, or unlike, or in contrast to Kim, Samuel found that adolescents' concentration skills are sharpened by time spent on social media. Clark found that, on the contrary, adolescent skills are dulled by social media. Conversely, May found, etc. And then finally, whereas Kim found that time spent on social media dulled concentration skills, Samuel found that it sharpened these skills. However, it should be noted that Samuel's study had a small sample of only 12 subjects. So I encourage you to use these words. If you're not using some of them, experiment with new words. I find that even just the addition of an adverb like similarly, or adjective similar, can really give a professional feeling to your writing. Going to move on to talk about tenses in syntheses, and just to say a few words about that. The present perfect tense, which is has or have plus past participle, is used to refer to more than one study. So here's an example. Many scientists have studied the effects of global warming on glaciers, followed by the names of those authors. And the simple past tense is used to refer to a single study. So here's an example. Hodges and Whitby studied Thwaite Glacier in Antarctica and found that it has receded by 5 kilometers since 1999. And then if you are referring to the views or conclusions of researchers from single studies, you can generally use either the past or the present tense, but you do need to be consistent. Here's an example. Black and Clark concluded that political instability has a complex set of causes. So these are just some general rules about tense use in syntheses and literature reviews. So now to sum up, a literature review synthesizes and critiques a body of work in order to support and explain the choices you have made about your study. To avoid the silo approach, use a thematic organization. Use signal words to show relationships. Use the verb tenses that are standard in your discipline.